Hello and welcome to the Symmetry Sessions podcast. I'm your host, Heather McPaul. Join me for in-depth, down-to-earth, and casual conversations about all things healthy, wealthy, and wise. We delve into topics related to therapy, mental health, relationships, business, and more with guests from all walks of life. And even though I am a professionally licensed counselor, this is just a show, and the information presented is just for informational, educational purposes only. It's definitely not meant to replace getting professional help from a doctor or a therapist. So please seek that help from a qualified healthcare professional if you need it. And if it is an emergency, please call 988 or other appropriate emergency services. I'm very excited to bring to you a variety of amazing guests and topics. So let's get started with today's episode. Welcome to the Symmetry Sessions. In this podcast, we've talked about lasting friendships and necessary ingredients for connection. But today, joining me to go in depth about friendships and even venture into the realm of frenemies is returning guest and close friend, Dr. Danielle Taylor. Welcome back, Danielle.
Hi, thank you so much for having me back. Really
I
excited to do a deep dive into
yeah
friends and frenemies.
yeah. So let's start with what is a frenemy. I mean, I feel like most people get the concept, but really, what does it mean?
That's a good question. And I think there are plenty of definitions out
Mm,
there. So for me, a frenemy is somebody who does not want to see you win. That's how I
mm,
would describe it and define it. And there are lots of different characteristics that go along with that. But this is just a person who does not have your best interests in mind. And they really are not in your corner. They're not an actual source of constructive, loving, compassionate support. How would you define a frenemy?
I was thinking about Mean Girls a little
Yeah.
bit, like that sort of uh, immature, yeah, competition thing.
Hmm.
Doesn't
Yeah.
want to see you win is a good, yeah. And it made me start to think because when I was thinking about, well, how do I define it, and the Mean Girls thing came up because I've known plenty of adults who still act like middle schoolers in that way. Um, it made me curious about the gender part of this, right? Because um, I feel like I guess I'm curious if men have this experience too.
Yeah, I wonder that as well. We know that the nature of men's and women's friendships tend to be different, and I want to highlight here that right now we are both speaking as to cisgender
Right.
women, so we're really speaking about our own lived experiences, and much of the research that exists on these kinds of relationships centers around cisgender, men, cisgender, women, and it does exclude other people's experiences. So I just want to own and acknowledge that
Yeah.
this is yeah, the focus is narrow and could certainly use to be broadened. But
Mm,
what's out there suggests that in men's heterosexual cisgendered male friendships, the focus tends to be on common activities. So this
mm.
is, getting together, maybe playing in a basketball league together, game night, something like that. And there's less emotional intimacy. Whereas in, cisgender heterosexual women's relationships, there tends to be more emotional intimacy, more sharing about life experiences, processing of emotions, and less focus necessarily on shared activities. There could be shared interest activities, but that's not typically the center of the relationship. It's usually more of the emotional intimacy. So when we look at some of the patterns in those relationships, we do find more relational aggression in relationships that involve cisgender women, and often more, if there's conflict in cisgender male relationships, more physical aggression might be possible when we're looking within like the bullying domain, which a
Mhm.
frenemy really is a covert kind of bullying. To my mind, it's sort of the like you mentioned Mean Girls, Heather, it's like the grown up air quotes grown up version of Mean Girls. People learn over time that certain things being expressed overtly, it's not socially acceptable, so they find these more passive aggressive subtle ways. So I don't know if there is any specific research on frenemies, but extrapolating from what's out there about relationships and bullying, which actually used to be, that was what my dissertation was on. So I spent a
Oh,
lot of time researching bullying and friendships and relationships. So
yeah.
that's
Let's talk
what we
about
know.
like some of the subtle ways that frenemies, because it's interesting, right? With those definitions, who would want to be, close to someone like that? But because there are, covert mannerisms, things that we don't always pick up on. What are those? What are some of those subtleties that um, infiltrate?
Yeah, I would say the most important and often overlooked one is how you feel when you're around the person, after
Hmm.
you've spent time with the person, or when you're anticipating spending time with the person. That can be an incredibly helpful source of information, and especially if you notice that felt sense for you is different about that person than it is about other people. There might be something that, your gut is really trying to tell you about that relationship that maybe you're not consciously picking up on.
Mm.
So that's something I'd really recommend, is like tuning into that sense. So what might you feel um, when you're going to see a frenemy, or after you've seen one, or even while you're together? So often it can be things like feeling drained, maybe
Hmm.
feeling a sense of anxiety or dread, just feeling kind of icky before, during, or after the interaction, or just like something is off, something doesn't feel comfortable. And then if you have a relationship that does feel really safe, just noticing how do you feel before, during, and after those interactions. And of course, we're all human, right? So like we all drain people at sometimes. We don't necessarily mean to, but it's just the nature of things. Relationships are not always 50-50. So we're really talking about looking for patterns of behavior, patterns of experiences over time.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that reminds me of one of the um, analogies or metaphors that I use with clients of mine to explain that feeling of being depleted energetically around people is from the TV show on Hulu. Oh gosh, what is it called? The show with the vampires.
What
Oh,
we
What
do in
We
the
Do in the
shadows.
Shadows. Yeah,
Mhm.
Colin Robinson and that girl that Colin Robinson meets, and I can't remember her name right now. He's an energy vampire. She's an emotional vampire.
Mhm.
Um, but just the reactions that people have around them, they just and it's such a because everybody knows somebody like that too.
Absolutely, yes. So yeah, Evie is Colin
Mm,
Robinson's on again, off again,
yeah.
emotional energy vampire girlfriend. And yeah, that's a fantastic analogy, because you can, really feel like that after you've been around somebody. And again, we're looking at, do you feel like that the majority of the time? I would say another important indicator is the person's reaction to your success, as opposed to
Mhm.
the person's reaction to, times when you're experiencing difficulty. So I think something that often gets people in these sort of relationships, or keeps them in the relationships, is because maybe this person is really willing to pick up the phone whenever you're having a tough time, because they, enjoy, you don't realize this at the time, but they enjoy hearing about your drama, not because they want to help you. They enjoy that you're having difficulties and challenges, because maybe it makes them feel better about themselves, or it's just sort of like, it's this sounds callous, but it's like it's for sport, like it's entertainment for them, and you're
Mm,
reading it as support because they're there and they're listening. But then when you share good news, they're maybe very dismissive, or they quickly change the subject to themselves, or they might ignore it entirely.
mhm.
Sometimes people will even, in like very unbelievable ways. They'll like turn the situation around and be upset with you about whatever you shared.
Yeah.
So that's another really big one. Just noticing in your relationships, like who can you share your losses with and your wins. And in a healthy friendship, there should be equal amount of space and support for both of those.
Yeah, I certainly think that misery loves company.
Yes.
Um, I think that's so true. And sometimes, if we're in a bad space, that can be what the relationship is all about, is
Hmm.
commiserating. But the minute that someone starts to get clarity or become healthier, I think that's when you start to notice really the difference in reaction, that they're no longer next to you.
Hmm.
Um, there is something threatening about about you getting healthier or being successful or something like that. And I've certainly had experiences like that where somebody's tried to sabotage something that was good that was happening for me,
Hmm.
or became very spiky, one word answers, not really engaging anymore. um, and I think this could go down the rabbit hole as we usually do, but there are certain, I think, predispositions for people to end up in situations where they might get be close to a frenemy or
Hmm.
think that's what friendship is.
Hmm.
I think if you've had dynamics like that at home, then that would seem very normal to be in something like that. But I think the biggest thing is that some of these subtleties, what's really happening here is that if we ignore them, it shows that we're lacking a sense of worth, a sense of deserving better than that.
Absolutely. And it's it's demonstrating maybe, and it's not necessarily true that there's a lack of self-respect, but maybe that's how it's being read by the other person. You're maybe being compassionate or trying to make a relationship work, and the other person is receiving that as, oh, this is somebody that I can kind of have some
Mm,
control over. And also, I think it's all about boundaries, right? So this would be another thing. So again, remembering we're all human, we're all going to do things that upset one another at times. But what happens when you set a boundary with somebody, right? So
mhm,
somebody makes a comment that's allegedly a joke, and then in front of other people, or maybe not in front of other people, but it often is in front of other people, and you go to them afterwards to process about it. How do they respond? And that
mhm,
can be a big indicator as to whether or not this is a healthy friendship, or if this is a frenemy situation. So again, if the person cannot hold space for your feedback about your experience of something that they said, or if they are dismissive, pretend that they forgot about it, it's not a big deal, shut down, stonewall you by ignoring you, those are all signs that this person could potentially be in frenemy territory. And similar thing, like if you set boundaries around contact, this is a big one. So going back to like the misery loves company thing,
mm,
so sometimes, right, when you're going through a tough time in life, you might be reaching out a lot to somebody. And maybe you and a friend are calling each other all the time, swapping, stories of tales of woe. And we all need that at times. But you might notice that somebody is always taking up like multiple hours of your day with tales of woe. They're not really doing anything to support their own growth or to find other sources of support. And then when you set a boundary around contact, like how much time you spend talking or when you talk, then that person might just really evaporate from your life. So
mm.
I'll share.
Or
I have,
or
oh,
be
go ahead.
persistent.
Or be persistent, right? Like they might increase the
I call
intensity.
it barnacling.
Right, they might, yeah, for sure. So that's a great point, Heather. So it's like some sort of boundary violation one way or the other. If you
Yeah.
say, hey, I'm really busy today, like I'm only can like text and I can talk tomorrow at 3 o'clock. and then they're like blowing your phone up, calling, or they might just vanish. I've actually had that experience with a relationship where I had somebody who was calling me all the time, asking me for advice about their child. And the child was involved in a bullying situation. And so I was giving them, tangible steps of things to try. And they kept calling and asking the same questions. They weren't putting anything into place. And this was over a period of months. And so I stopped answering the phone when they would call, and then I would like call back at a designated time, and I would typically start the call by saying, "Hey, I only have 20 minutes to talk." Well, after a couple times of me doing that, they literally never called me again. And it
Mm-hmm.
just was, it sort of shocked me, but how quickly that changed. But when they weren't able to get what they wanted from me on demand when they wanted it, then the relationship dissolved. It wasn't working for
Yeah.
them. So, and that's another characteristic of an unbalanced relationship or unhealthy connection, is that one person is really trying to get specific things from the other person. It's not
Right.
about the experience of being connected as humans and enjoying, maybe enjoying is not the right word, but sharing about this experience, of being humans, being alive together, sometimes enjoying things, sometimes having struggles. It's about, I have this relationship to get X, Y, and Z. And that might not even be
Yeah.
fully conscious. I want to
No, I don't think
own
it
that.
is a lot of the
Yeah.
time. And I think about one particular client of mine, and this is an ongoing discussion, exploration, whatever. But, one of the things that we've had to explore is the difference between being nice and being kind,
Hmm.
right? Nice is a doormat, kind is firmly stating your your boundaries in a compassionate way. And I think a lot of times you hear um, that our culture, especially for women, I feel like value niceness over kindness. And so a lot of people, a lot of women specifically, get caught up in these situations where they feel like and to your point before, no, it's not just about people who have a lack of self-esteem or something like that. Sometimes it's that there's a
Hmm.
vulnerability because they think they have to be nice,
Hmm.
or they want to be nice, and that gets taken advantage of. Because I don't know if it's an odor or what it is, but I feel like if you have vulnerabilities, these kind of people that, you know, that we're talking about, frenemies, they just smell that shit a mile away.
Yeah. I totally hear that. And a couple things that I've learned over the years. The first thing is, it's not that people who have selfish intent, like who might operate sort of as frenemies or maybe have narcissistic qualities. It's not that they are like attracted to certain people always, or that certain people are attracted to them. It's just that certain people allow them to stay
Right.
in their lives, right? So
Hmm.
there's sort of things out there about, law of attraction and manifestation and things like that, that if we have repeated encounters with frenemies or with narcissists, that it's because we're attracting them. And it's like, no, it's just that some people allow them to take up space in their lives for longer. And the reasons why are like things that you mentioned. Maybe there's some previous familial experience or other
Hmm.
experience, some other vulnerabilities. I think people in our field can be susceptible because we're used to holding space for people with all sorts of lived experiences. I mean,
Yeah.
the kinds of things that are shared in sessions and that we meet with compassion and openness, I think puts us in a particularly vulnerable place sometimes, even if we don't have our own trauma histories, because we're just accustomed to being supportive and understanding. And so that's why it's so important to be really clear on what our boundaries are and what
Yeah.
our needs are in relationships, and to be able to more quickly discern whether or not somebody is able to be part of that kind of relationship based on where they are in their journey.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think as therapists, everybody's sort of attracted to that. When you tell somebody what you do for a living, immediately they're like, "Well, let me tell you about this thing that happened to me," or "What do you think I should do about this kid that I have," or whatever. But so, yes, it makes sense that that's just kind of part of maybe how we get stuck in that as therapists sometimes.
Yeah, and so many people feel so invisible and so, unheard and unvalidated, that when there's some sort of a potential that someone's going to be a source of that, I do see that there's a sense that there's a tendency to maybe unload and overshare in general, because your assumption is that person is a safe space, right? So
Mhm.
even if that isn't an individual's like typical MO, like to your point, when somebody knows you're a therapist, they might feel more comfortable sharing stuff, because there is that deep desire to be seen, heard, sensed, understood, validated.
I mean, at this point in our world today, like right now, I don't even know that it takes an awareness of safe space anymore. I think everybody's just so traumatized; they're just
Mhm.
unloading wherever they can.
Yeah, it definitely, that sense of discernment about what's safe and what isn't safe has diminished in some
Mm,
ways. Yeah, and I think that, when we're talking about, again, like healthy connections and less healthy connections, any sort of imbalance like that is important to notice too. If there's not room for you in an interaction or in a relationship, and everything always is focusing on the other person, or you try to bring something to the table and it always goes back to the other person, without any room for you, then that could be a sign that there's an issue. I want
I
to
think,
I want to offer one caveat,
yeah.
which is, if you have connections with people who have neurodivergent traits, one of the things that's
Mhm.
out there that's like, oh, if someone shares something with you, don't immediately bring up a relatable story. Many people who experience neurodivergence do that as a way of relating.
Mhm.
So I would just be mindful to not use that as sort of a blanket um, tool in evaluating the quality of a relationship.
Sure.
Um, Especially if you point out to the person, talking about setting boundaries, like, if you mention to them, I appreciate when you share stories about your experience, but I'd really like you to just listen to mine right now. And whether or not they're able to do that will give you a lot of, helpful information. But I do just want to share that. That's very common.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, I will also say that having worked with a lot of daughters of narcissists, one of the things, and I'll put the book in the show notes because I can't remember the author at the moment, but um, the saying, like, if you lay down with dogs, you're going to get fleas. Oftentimes, daughters of narcissists, and I'm generalizing here because it's probably also children of narcissists, but because you're raised by somebody who doesn't have any relational awareness, um, isn't very present, only reverts back to themselves. Sometimes daughters of or children of narcissists can get stuck doing that because that was what was modeled for them, not
Hmm.
necessarily because that's how they are, but because that's what they learned. And so, yeah, there are some nuances about how this might look. And so, how do we not jump to conclusions?
That's an important question, and I think a lot of it has to do with asking for what we need in our relationships and seeing how the other that lands for the other person.
Mhm.
Or, are we able to give feedback without feeling afraid of how that's going to land? Are we open to receiving feedback? We also want to make sure we're not being frenemies. And when I say feedback, I mean something that's constructive and focused on growth that comes from a place of kindness and compassion. So, not criticism, not digs, not, um, passive aggressive comments, but, if somebody says to you, hey, when you said this, it made me feel this way. Or I felt upset about after our conversation the other day. Are you able to be open to that? And is the other person able to be open to hearing the same? I think that can really provide a lot of clarity about where both of you are in the relationship and what's the nature of what's happening. Another thing that can be helpful is modeling what it is that you're looking for. So, and then asking for the same. So for example, I definitely have a part of me that when someone shares something that I can relate to, I'm like, oh, I want to share something too, so they feel less alone. um, Especially when if they've had an experience that can feel pretty isolating. So I try to ask, I try to say, hey, do you want to hear something related, or would you just like me to listen right now? Or,
Mm,
even asking, would you just like for me to listen, or are you interested in like some thoughts I have of what you could do? It can feel awkward at first asking those kinds of questions, or asking your friends to interact with you that way too, but it really clears up a lot of
mm,
it prevents a lot of like miscommunications and hurt feelings, where sometimes you just want to vent. Sometimes you do feel really alone and you want to hear from someone else that they've experienced something similar, and sometimes you're trying to figure out what to do and you want help solving a problem. So I think clearly communicating on those fronts can really help, and again, seeing how people respond to your requests, knowing that everyone's different and they might need a little bit of time to process what you've asked them for, right?
yeah.
So don't take if someone isn't immediately able to shift gears, that doesn't mean they're a frenemy. They might just need a little more space.
Yeah. Or processing time or something like that.
Hmm.
It's interesting. I love that you do that, by the way, the asking. And in the focus oriented therapy training that I've been doing recently, one of the things that they say is they help us practice being the listener and being the sharer. And when you're the listener, you wait till the very end to say, would you like a reflection from me?
Hmm.
And that it's totally okay if the person's like, no, I really don't. and so I like that checking in of like, is this okay with you if I share my perspective on that, or how that
Hmm.
makes me feel, or something like that? Because I think too often, and I think we're all guilty of that at some point, is like just the vomiting back and forth, which is a terrible metaphor, but
Yeah, absolutely. There can be a lot of like story swapping, and I have
mm,
some friends that's exclusively our relationship. Like we will literally been friends for many, many years, and we will literally just be swapping the weekly woes, and that's okay, right? Like that's the
yeah.
space that friendship is in. We're both contributing the same thing in the same way, and we're good with that. And I don't know that this is necessarily about spotting a frenemy, but just talking about like healthy relationships, like
Hmm.
different relationships are going to, meet different sorts of wants and needs in your life. And not
For sure.
every friendship has to be this, really deep connection. You
Hmm.
can have friendships that support your journey and support the other person's journey in different kinds of ways, and that's totally okay. I think what gets things in a little bit of a dicey territory is when the two people in the relationship have different ideas about what the relationship is. So maybe one person's investing a lot more, one person feels a lot closer than the other person, and when you start having like a significant imbalance, that's when there can be some challenges and some difficulties, um, that might come into play.
Yeah. What other subtleties might there be? Did we cover all of them?
I think we covered many of them, right? We didn't talk about the classic backhanded compliment.
Mm.
Um, I know we mentioned passive aggression, but backhanded compliments are a big one that you might see in an unhealthy friendship, and it's really tough because those sorts of things can be difficult to call out. And again, a lot of it just has to do with how what the person said made you feel. Like if you just notice a lot of times that the comments people are making about you or towards you just make you feel uncomfortable, trust that, right?
Mm.
So I'll share an example. I often wear a lot of like neutral colored clothing, and I went into work one day and I was wearing pink, and a former coworker, turned around and looked at me and said, "Oh, she's finally wearing some color." And so, me being me, I said, "Well, I love kicking my morning off with a nice passive aggressive compliment." And the person then became very upset. And, I wasn't being passive aggressive. I wasn't, and I was just saying that I like the color of your shirt. And I just said, "Well, I wish that you would have said that instead."
Yeah.
So it's, it's that kind of stuff. I'm laughing because, of course, part of me chose in that moment to highlight that to that person. I want to add for context for our listeners that this was a person that I saw engaging in relational aggression with another coworker at work on a
Mm.
pretty regular basis, and they back and forth, where they were making comments about one another's appearance all the time, making comments about one another's age, about the way their offices smelled. I mean, so this was like an ongoing thing. And then when that sort of comment was made to me, I thought, yeah, I'm gonna set a boundary here, and highlight what's being said in the moment. Should I have made a sarcastic joke back? Maybe not. Maybe I should have just said, "What do you mean by that?" Right?
Mm.
So, as a psychologist, I would advise that you say something like, "What do you mean by that?" Or, "That made me feel uncomfortable." So,
Mm.
yeah, don't do as I did.
Do
But
meet them where they're at with that, because yeah. Although
I
sometimes
have
it's hard not
yeah,
to.
I have a part that in the face of those things likes to be like clever, and likes to make like a little clever comment here or there. So
Yeah.
yeah. Um, but yeah, that's another example. Or they just do things that are hurtful. So I'll share another example from somebody I know. So I knew somebody who really struggled with an eating and exercise disorder. They had been incredibly underweight at one point, and so they had a friend that they would like. This friend also had issues in the same area, and they would sometimes like give each other, clothes from their wardrobe that was still in good condition, but they didn't wear anymore. And so as this person was getting healthier, they were like, in their process, they were gaining weight that they needed to gain. This frenemy gave this person a bag of clothes, and all of the clothes in the bag were clearly too small for the person. So the person at that point was probably like, I'm not going to even name sizes, but they were at a healthier size, and this person gave them, for their body, gave them clothes that were clearly like three sizes, too small, and were like an
Mm.
incredibly small size of clothes. So, that's like another example, and then it's easy for the person to sort of, wiggle out of it by saying like, "Oh, well, I thought that was still your size,"
Mm.
even though based on clear, visual observation, it wasn't. So, um, just any kind of stuff like that. If you feel like somebody is doing things, saying things, creating situations where they are commenting on your appearance, existence, way of being in a way that is, critical and unhelpful, and is really, highlighting your struggles, putting you down, especially in front of other people, is a common tactic. Um, all of those things can be signs of, an unhealthy connection, aka a frenemy.
Yeah, and I don't even think it has to be that um uh passive aggressive or covert. I mean, some
Hmm.
people are just more out about it. I think that when there are one of the things I think people can look out for is like when there are big occasions in your life. I've
Yes.
always felt like weddings and funerals really bring out the frenemy in people.
Uh-huh.
And in my own wedding, I remember a particular person who was supposed to be in the bridal party was not in the bridal party because she told me literally, I can't be happy for you.
Wow.
Yeah. Um, that was the beginning of the end for that. But yeah, some people aren't that subtle.
Hmm.
And yet sometimes people still don't, it doesn't compute.
Mm-hmm. First, I want to say I'm really sorry to hear that you had that experience, and it sounds very uncomfortable at a minimum, and likely painful. It is, yeah. That was a good thing to bring up. How people respond to important events in your life, or
Hmm.
any sort of important milestone or benchmark or party. Another one connected to that in the less subtle realm. Sometimes you'll schedule something like a party or a baby shower or something, and then a person will schedule something on the same exact day,
Oh, yeah.
or
Yeah.
they'll do listeners out there. Okay, if you're attending somebody's wedding and you want to propose to your significant other, please don't
No,
do it at their wedding.
no. Big faux pas.
Right? Like, and I get it that some people do things like that innocently, but you're shifting the focus from that person, that
And
couple's
don't wear
special
white.
day.
That's a big thing for
Yeah.
me. Don't wear
Right.
don't
Yeah.
do it.
Yes. Yeah. Please honor the cultural traditions of the ceremony that you're attending, and
Mm.
wearing white for many weddings is a no, unless you're the bride.
Hmm.
Um, don't don't announce that you're pregnant at somebody else's, at someone's engagement party or wedding, like it just it's thunder stealing, is what
Yeah,
I would say,
I like
connected to what
that.
you shared. Um, there's plenty of thunder to go around, right? If we can shift out of this scarcity mindset. So as far as like what's something that we can do,
Mm.
growing up in a capitalist society where we are taught to believe that there isn't enough of anything. That's what we're taught. Even, there's not enough love, there's not enough friendship, there's not enough attention. And that creates a scarcity mindset. And I will speak from my lived experience as a woman who was born in the early 80s, and so grew up in 80s, 90s, coming of age in the early aughts. We were actively taught to compete with other women. We were
Hmm.
really taught that there was only room in many settings and spaces for like a handful of women. And so, in various ways, socially, academically, the competition that I observed amongst women up through, my college years was absolutely fierce. Like, I didn't know, I really, thinking back on college, it was like almost everyone in like each academic department, like the women who were really bright, so many of them had other women who were also really bright, and they were like mortal enemies just on account of the fact that they both existed. It's not like there was any sort of personal issues between them. It was just like, well, I'm really smart and they're really smart, and we're in the same academic major, and there's only room for one of us. It's almost like, if any of the listeners have seen the movie like The Highlander, those movies where it's like there can only be one. That was a lot of there was a lot of like overt and covert messaging in my generation, in my lived experience, for women, that there was really only room for one of us.
Yeah.
um, and that we had to compete for men, we had to compete for status, again, we had to compete for love. So anyway, that also exists for other genders. This isn't just exclusive to women, but since we're kind of talking a lot about female, cisgender hetero friendships, um, that really contributes to that. So when we
Mm.
can notice the ways in which we're holding on to that scarcity mindset and we're allowing that to drive relationships, that can be a really important turning point, to realizing that we can all win. And if we work together and collaborate and support each other in pursuing, our dreams, whatever they may be, that we're going to be better off than cutting each other down, competing, all of those kinds of things. So I think just noticing where scarcity mindset shows up for ourselves, noticing the times when all of us as humans, when we see somebody else in real life or on social media, and we notice some sort of a pang of jealousy or discontent, like really turning towards what's there,
Mm.
the hurt that's there within each of us.
Hmm.
I think the better that we can be aware of those things within ourselves, and tend to that pain, the better we can show up in our relationships. And also, if another friend is willing and wants to, um, we can offer a supportive, safe space when we notice somebody trying to create that kind of dynamic with us. So that was a long-winded answer.
Yeah, no, I like that because had a conversation with a close friend of mine about previous experiences where I could not share good things.
Hmm.
And because of that, the trauma the trauma reaction now is, "Hey," and I did this to you earlier.
Yeah.
"Hey, couldn't you receive like can you listen to something good that happened to me?" Because it's happened way too many times where I've gone to share that with another woman and all they could think of was how they're not in that space and how, whatever jealousy whatever pops up for them. And I remember having this conversation with my one friend, and we were talking about that around something I had shared, I forget. And she was like, "Well, initially I felt like a little thing of like, ooh, I wish that was me too. But then I came back to being present with you because that's awesome." Or I don't even know what we were talking
Yeah.
about. But, and I think that, of course, we can all acknowledge we're all human. Like, we're all going to be like, oh, damn, I wish that was me too. Or, oh, that's so cool. I wish I could have that. Um, but but admitting that and then being
Hmm.
able to return back to being present is, I mean, yeah, that's what it's about. Instead of just staying in that place of like, um, well, now I hate you because you have this and I don't. It's not
Yeah,
a competition.
exactly.
Friendship
And
shouldn't be.
no, definitely. And there's a way for all of us to win. There really is. Now, is it harder for some people to quote unquote win? Of course, because the game was designed by a particular group of people for them to win. So it is, yes,
I
it
was
is
gonna say it's the
absolutely
the global cult.
right. So it is harder. The interesting thing though is that a lot of times, part of what helps the people that the game was designed for, part of what helps them keep winning is that the people that the game wasn't designed for are really busy attacking each other in the
Yeah,
background, right?
exactly.
So that really keeps the playing field very clear for those people that designed the system and benefit most from the, air quotes, the system. um so yeah, there is space for all of us. There's room for it. So it's like every time we notice ourselves, minimizing our own internal experiences, minimizing our own, gut sense, all of that stuff. If we continue to do that and turn away from ourselves, the more likely that we're going to do that to other people. So
Yeah.
this is really the kind of thing that starts with us as far as our ability to show up in a healthy way in relationships, and also to notice when something is off and then trust that notice, you know
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things is when you've done the internal work on yourself, even if you fall into one of these things where you have a reaction in the frenemy zone,
hmm
it's all about the repair, right?
yes.
It's all about owning it and repairing it and saying, "Hey, I had this moment," um, and that we should be able to do that in an adult relationship.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because of with all relationships there will be ruptures. That is inevitable. And it's really an opportunity for the relationship to grow and evolve, but it does depend on the repair and the ability
Mhm.
of both people to see what they contributed to it, right? The contributions might be very different, and for people to be accountable and open and willing and interested, invested in making changes and shifting.
Mm.
This is actually a different kind of frenemy spin, right? So we've talked a lot about frenemies being sort of like actively terrible. Okay, yes, very clinical term, right? So frenemy is like actively doing stuff that's like unkind and considerate. But another thing that you might see in a frenemy dynamic is that you mess up, right? On account of our humanness, on account of the fact that we do all get activated by different things, and we're not always able to show up as our best. So let's say that you have a misstep, and then you reach out to the person and you own that and you want to repair. It's like, hey, I realize that what I did was not okay. Like, I don't know exactly how it landed for you, but I'm, hypothesizing X, Y, and Z. I'm not okay with operating like that. So these are the steps like I've already taken to work on this. I'm just wondering if there's any way that like we can connect, walk through this, repair. Um, and then sometimes people will just pretend there was no issue and then fade out of your life. And that is a total frenemy tactic, right? Like, because if a person didn't want you in their life anymore, which is totally okay, they can decide that. But if you have a relationship with somebody and you make a misstep, the expectation is that there would either be some opportunity for repair or there would be some kind of acknowledgement that this just isn't a good fit for me anymore. Like I don't want to be friends. But there often isn't that. And there's actually a whole body of work out there that I'm less familiar with about like friends ghosting each other and like and unresolved friend breakups and how it
Hmm.
comes from the same place as, people ghosting in romantic relationships. Like this paucity of ability to hold space for repair. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, that's really hurting all of our relationships because there's always going to be rupture. So
Hmm.
that's another way a frenemy might show up. It's like as soon as you've offended them in some way, they're they're out.
Yeah. And, but it's interesting, right, to think about, um, is that really what's happening? Because I feel like everybody's like, but me first, right?
Mhm.
You need to apologize to me.
Mhm.
Um, without having any clarity about how we've each contributed to the relationship. And I know that it probably has seemed to people that I have ghosted people in the past, but actually, I feel like I'm one of those people that takes a long time to process, what do I want here? And I've always learned, especially how I grew up, that I need distance to be able to be clear and
Mhm.
make a decision and also just be open to whatever it's going to be. Um, but I do think that people get stuck in this like me first thing. And I think that shows that, first of all, the relationship isn't working for either of us,
Yeah.
if that's how it's going,
Mhm.
you know?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of value in communicating to people you're in relationships with about how you operate, like
Yeah.
about how you work or what's happening for you. A little bit of proactive communication really goes a long way, if you need space to process or if I know sometimes when I know I'm going to be really busy during the day, when typically maybe I would be available intermittently, I will try to let people know like, hey, I've got like a wild day today. So if you don't hear from me, that's why. Because, and not every single person I know, but people who I'm in regular contact with, because I don't, you want to let people know where you're coming from. And there's no, there's no upside to have somebody guessing and feeling uncertain, right? Like how does that serve you? And how does that really like, serve the other person? And I think there's a difference. I think there's also a difference between relationships where there have been like repeated rupture without full closure, like both
Mm,
parties fully participating in closure, and what happens to maybe the one party who is trying to repair and the other person isn't being involved, and
mm.
situations where it's like a single incident, like a seemingly small single incident
Oh,
rupture,
yeah.
and then the
Sure.
other person just being like, no explanation, just kind of like vanishing, right? that
Yeah,
that's like
'cause
a ghost.
yeah.
If you're taking space after a series of incidents, that's not a ghosting.
Right, and I remember you and I talking a long time ago about, I always say, like, especially when dealing with like narcissistic people or egocentric people, like, you have to know your audience too.
Yeah,
Like, are they even going to be able to absorb what you're saying? Sometimes having a conversation isn't even worth the energy.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and you learn that over time based on your interactions with them.
Yeah.
And sometimes it isn't. I'll often, when I've found myself in situations like that, I'll connect with, my parts and really get the sense of, okay, do you want to communicate because you want to use your voice to express something regardless of response or outcome?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you want to communicate because you're hoping that the other person will do, say, act XYZ way, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And so if I get a sense that it's like the communication is designed to have some it's like dependent on some sort of response, then I'll normally do some more work internally. If it's at a place where it's like, this is something I just really want to express regardless of whether there's any response at all, or if, the response is hostile, whatever, this is just something that we feel we need to express, then I will go ahead and express it. Like, and that's, I'm talking about like in a relationship that's really like on its last legs, or where there's been, a series of ruptures, or like one single incident, really significant rupture, something like that. And there have
Yeah.
been no attempts to repair. But other relationships, like, we do things all the time that rupture, annoy, irritate, like challenge. And in safe relationships, we can share that with the other person when we find something's really like sticking for us, even if a component of why it's sticking for us is because something in us is activated, right?
Right.
Like,
Sure.
if we're in like a loving, compassionate connection, shouldn't you care that something is
Shouldn't you
activated in you?
care?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're
Shouldn't it
touching on.
matter?
Yeah.
you know
Yeah, I mean, you keep touching on a word keeps popping up, and it's the word agenda, right? Like,
yes. Yeah.
eh, you know, going into a relationship and having an agenda for what it's supposed to be, like to serve you, is probably a frenemy type of perspective, right?
100%.
But also, approaching that rupture, approaching that frenemy, like what is the agenda for you in that? And so it's really about like, how are we showing up and why?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it really is about really knowing yourself and what works for you and what doesn't, and having boundaries and expectations, and
Yeah.
having space for different relationships to be different.
Yeah.
You, and just being discerning about those who are closest to you, and
Hmm.
really making sure that what each of you are bringing to the dynamic is what you're both looking for, and that
Yeah.
there's room for growth and evolution. And that means room for rupture, repair, and ongoing change. And that can feel really scary for people, because there's this misnomer out there that like relationships are only valuable when they stay the same and they last forever, right? We hear
Hmm.
so often that it's like, what kinds of marriages are celebrated? Oh, the people who were married for 65 years. And but you have no clue what the interior of that
No.
marriage looked like. And I think the more, again, and I'm focusing so much on our own inner work, but it's like the more we give ourselves space to be dynamic, and changing, the more space we can allow our relationships to do that too. And so we don't get so attached to the idea of what a friendship is supposed to be. And I think it just makes it easier to invite the things in that really work for you, recognize the things that don't work for you, and to let those things go, without trying so hard to make them work.
Yeah. I had a client the other day say, keep your enemies close, right? And I was like, no. Now, first of all, I'm too old for that shit. And I think that there is something to be said about, you know, a sense of maturity coming from doing your own inner work, and just realizing, like you said, like, this shit doesn't, it's not what I want,
Yeah.
or this is what I want, or, really knowing what your friendship should look like.
Hmm.
Um, it's funny, in episode 14, when I talked to my friend Susanna about how did we how are we still friends after 30, 35 years, whatever, whatever it's been. One of the key things that we talk about is being flexible, though,
Hmm.
right? Because you have to allow people to evolve. But if I think for me, the, you know sort of non-negotiable, or whatever you want to call it, is that if you're not evolving,
Yeah.
if you're still stuck in, and you're not creating change, and you're not, you know, um, I'm too far ahead on the path. It's just not going to jive, and it's not even personal. For many of the friends that I've had to give up over the years, it was never out of malice. I was never,
Hmm.
I was hurt, and that made a part of me angry, but I was never mad at the person, because this is just where you're at. And love and light, man, but like, that's not for me.
Absolutely. And a friendship can be, any relationship can be a beautiful thing. It can be an incredible experience that contributes to your growth. That's an important part of your journey. And it can end and it can still be all those things.
Sure.
Just because something ends doesn't detract from the value of the experience that you
For
had.
sure.
And agreed, right? Like, so when you're conscious of the reality that life is about transition and change, and so you can make roughly two choices. You can choose to be an active participant in that,
Mhm. Mhm.
or you can choose to just passively be tossed. And it does become very difficult to maintain meaningful connections with people who are not, they don't have the same
Participating.
that don't have the same philosophy in
Yeah.
life, right? So
Yeah.
if you are doing your best to like actively show up, participate, be conscious, be awake, live mindfully, consciously, and you have connections with people who just want to get by, right? That's going to become a significant mismatch over time, and that's okay that
Yeah,
they just
that's
want to get
okay.
by. That's
Yeah.
their choice, and you can honor that and respect it, and know that that means that likely the relationship dynamic is going to shift over
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would just close with what I started with, which is just pay attention to how it feels to be
Mhm.
around the person and trust that.
Yeah.
We often question our gut instincts, and they are there and real, for a reason. Yes, it can be important to sometimes to back that up with more information or more experience, but if you're consistently walking away from interactions with somebody and just feeling exhausted or sad or uncomfortable, you don't have to keep interacting with that person. And if you really just have this nagging sense that something isn't right, something isn't right. And
Mhm.
when we're talking about a voluntary connection, like a friendship, you don't have to stay in things that aren't aligned with you. You don't have to stay in things that make you feel uncomfortable if
Mhm.
you don't want to. There are plenty of other places to feel uncomfortable that will be focusing on like growth and evolution, but we need safe spaces in our life. And if you consistently feel like a relationship is not a safe space, you're allowed to set it down and walk away.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, well said. I really appreciate you uh coming out and coming out. Joining me and talking about this, because I know so many people who battle, or grapple with the guilt of letting go of some relationships that really just don't work for them.
Mm.
And I always tell them, guilt goes away.
Yeah. We don't have to make everything work.
Yeah.
We don't have
And,
to.
it brings up in just one last thing. In one of David Kessler's books, he's a big name in grief counseling. In one of his books about loss, he talks about how, in the divorce section, he talks about how everybody thinks that a successful marriage is till death do you part. And he says, but that's not true. A successful marriage can be, 6 years, 2 years. It really depends on how you define success. And I think we can look at friendships quite the same way. It's like, it was what it needed to be at the time. It doesn't mean that you have to keep it around.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. So I would say keep your friends close and invite your frenemies to exit your life.
Yeah. Good. Thank you. Thank you so much for talking to us about this.
Thank you so much for having me on. And yeah,
All right. Take care. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you're interested in connecting with Heather or the guest today, please see the show notes for that info. If you'd like to be a guest on the Symmetry Sessions, the link to send us your request is also in the show notes. If you enjoyed the show and you'd like to show some support, buy me a coffee at www.buymeacoffee.com/symmetrysesh, SYMMETRYSESH. You can make a small donation to help keep the episodes coming. And when you buy me a coffee, you're supporting small business professionals and podcasters. Every donation helps me to get better podcasting equipment and network to find new and interesting guests. Don't miss an episode. The Symmetry Sessions launches every first Friday of the month, so make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time.